The crisp chill of a Pennsylvania autumn hung in the air the morning Caroline Foster stepped out of the life she'd known for 40 years. Just a few months earlier, she had still been in the brick townhouse she and her husband James had bought in their 20s, the place where they'd raised their only son, hosted countless Sunday dinners, and built a lifetime of memories. Then, without warning, James was gone. A heart attack at work. No last words. No godbis. Just silence and paperwork and a future Caroline had never imagined facing alone. She thought at least the house, their home, would still be hers, that the life they had built together would remain in some form after he was gone. But the day the will was read shattered that illusion. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. Caroline sat quietly at the end of the table, fingers twisted together in her lap, listening as the attorney read through James's last will and testament. His voice was flat, businesslike. "Per Mr. Foster's wishes," he said, "the townhouse on Elm Street, the lake cabin, and the 2021 SUV will all pass to your son, Richard Foster." Caroline blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Richard? Everything." The attorney continued, barely pausing. "To you, Mrs. Foster, he leaves the deed to garage unit number 47, located on the edge of town." A garage. That was it. After 4 decades of marriage, the only thing James had left her was a dusty old garage in a forgotten part of Lancaster. The same one where they'd once parked their first car when they could barely afford gas. Richard was thrilled. When Caroline called him that afternoon, his tone was brisk, practical. "Mom, it makes sense," he said. "I've got kids to raise, a mortgage, responsibilities. Dad was just thinking about the future. You'll be fine. You've got your pension, and you don't need much." She hung up without saying much. Because what could she say? That her life, the one she'd built around her family, her marriage, her home, had just been reduced to a crumbling garage on the edge of town? That James, the man who used to bring her coffee in bed and kiss her forehead every night, had apparently decided she didn't need anything more than a roof over a pile of tools and rust? In the weeks that followed, Caroline packed her things and left the house she'd believed would always be hers. She rented a small room in an aging house across town. Her monthly Social Security check, just under $1,200, covered the basics: rent, groceries, medication. Nothing more. The walls felt too close, the nights too long. She spent hours staring out the narrow window, remembering the sound of James humming while he fixed a leaky faucet, the smell of cinnamon rolls on Sunday mornings, the feel of his hand in hers during quiet walks. All of that felt impossibly far away now. And then there was the garage, the one piece of James's life that still had her name on it. She hadn't gone near it since the will was read. She told herself it was because it didn't matter, that it was just a dusty, old storage space. But deep down, she knew the real reason. Going there meant facing everything she'd lost. It meant admitting that the man she'd trusted with her whole life had left her behind with nothing but a padlocked box full of ghosts. Still, something about it nagged at her. Why just the garage? Why nothing else? As the leaves turned red and gold and the air grew colder, Caroline felt a shift inside her, a small, stubborn spark that refused to be snuffed out. Maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to see for herself what James had left behind. And so, one gray October afternoon, she decided she would go. She would unlock garage number 47 and walk inside, not just to look at what was there, but to understand what it meant. And without knowing it, that small decision would change the rest of her life. 2 months passed before Caroline found the courage to face the only thing James had left her. It was a gray, chilly afternoon when she finally decided to see garage number 47 for herself. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, tucked the old brass key into her pocket, and boarded the city bus that would take her to the far edge of Lancaster, to a place she hadn't set foot in for decades. The ride there was quieter than she remembered. Rows of small brick houses gave way to warehouses and weathered storefronts, and eventually to the low sprawl of the old garage cooperative. As the bus rolled to a stop, a familiar ache tightened in her chest. She and James had driven down this same road countless times when they were young, back when they owned a beat-up Ford sedan and believed the world was theirs to conquer. They used to spend weekends here, polishing chrome and dreaming about long road trips they never quite took. The cooperative looked tired now. Half the garage doors were rusted shut, their numbers faded and barely legible. Weeds pushed up through the cracks in the pavement. Caroline walked slowly along the row of units until she reached number 47. The blue paint on the doors had long since peeled away, leaving behind patches of dull gray metal streaked with rust. The hinges groaned when she touched them, and the padlock felt stiff, as if it hadn't been turned in years. For a long moment, Caroline just stood there. Part of her wanted to turn around, to go back to the bus stop and forget all about this place. But another part, the part that refused to let James's final gesture go unexplained, pushed her forward. She slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then gave way with a reluctant click. The doors creaked open, and darkness spilled out like a breath held too long. Caroline reached for the light switch just inside the wall. The bulb flickered once, twice, then glowed weakly to life. And when her eyes adjusted, she froze. This wasn't a forgotten storage unit filled with dusty junk. This was something else entirely. Workbenches lined the walls, each one neatly arranged with rows of tools, from wrenches and torque meters to precision instruments she didn't even recognize. Shelves above them held small labeled bins packed with bolts, gears, and chrome-plated parts. The concrete floor was clean, swept of debris, and in the center of the room stood something that made her breath catch, a motorcycle. It wasn't just any motorcycle. It was a Harley-Davidson, its deep black paint gleaming beneath the dim light, every curve polished, every detail cared for. It looked as though it had just rolled off the assembly line, despite being decades old. Caroline took a hesitant step closer, her reflection rippling faintly across the surface of the gas tank. James had never mentioned anything about motorcycles. In all their years together, he had never once hinted that he was interested in them. And yet here was this perfect machine, and clearly it hadn't built or restored itself. Beside the Harley, on a small wooden table, lay a thick folder. Caroline reached for it with trembling hands. Inside were dozens of photographs. James in his 20s astride a motorcycle she'd never seen before, faded clippings from old magazines about classic bikes, hand-drawn diagrams of engines annotated in James's handwriting. And tucked into the very back of the folder, as if waiting just for her, was a single envelope. Her name was written across the front in James's familiar script. To Caroline. She stared at it for a long time before touching it, her fingers tracing the loops of his handwriting. Whatever was inside, she knew it was more than just words. It was a piece of him, a part of his life he had never shared, a secret world he had built here without her. Standing alone in that quiet garage, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal and memory, Caroline felt something shift inside her. For the first time since James had died, she didn't feel forgotten. She felt as though he was right there, just beyond reach, waiting for her to take the next step. Caroline stared at the envelope for a long time before she had the courage to open it. Her name, Caroline, written in James's familiar hand, felt like a whisper from another world. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "My dearest Caroline," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to explain all of this in person. And for that, I'm sorry. I owe you the truth, the whole truth, about this place." James confessed that for years he had kept a part of himself hidden, a part he wasn't sure she would understand. The garage, he wrote, was his refuge, the one place where he wasn't a husband or a father or a company man. It was where he was simply James again, the young boy who had fallen in love with engines and open roads long before life became about bills and responsibilities. "I didn't tell you because I thought you might see it as foolish," the letter continued. A man in his 60s tinkering with machines like a teenager. I didn't want you to think I was wasting time, but this was never about wasting time. It was about holding on to the part of me that was still free. Caroline's eyes blurred with tears as she read on. James described the hours he'd spent here after work, often telling her he was meeting friends. He admitted those friends were other men just like him, older, grayer, but still boys at heart, still dreaming of the wind in their faces and the hum of an engine beneath them. Then there was something else. Look under the workbench in the far corner, James wrote. There's a safe. The code is the date we were married. Inside, you'll find what I couldn't leave in a will. Caroline lowered the letter and crossed the room, her breath catching as she spotted the small safe tucked beneath the heavy workbench. Her hand shook as she punched in the date, September 14th, 1981. With a soft click, the door swung open. Inside were 3 envelopes containing the titles to 3 motorcycles, a ring of keys, and a thick stack of $100 bills bound neatly with rubber bands. She pulled one bundle free and counted. Then another. Then another. Her heart pounded. More than $200,000. Cash James had earned restoring and selling old bikes over the years. At the very bottom of the safe, folded with care, was another letter. She unfolded it slowly, bracing herself. Caroline, James wrote again. I know this might look strange, leaving Richard the house, the cabin, the car, and leaving you this garage. But I know my son. He's practical to a fault. If I left this place to him, he'd sell everything in a week and never think of it again. That's not a criticism. It's just who he is. And that's why I left him things. I left you something else, my heart. This garage is where I was happiest. It's where I dreamed, where I remembered what it felt like to be 20 again. It's where I thought about you, always you. Every bolt I turned, every engine I rebuilt, I carried you with me. If you want, sell everything here and live comfortably. No one would blame you. But if you choose to keep it, if you choose to see what I saw in this place, then maybe you'll understand what I was trying to give you. Not just machines, a piece of my soul, and the faith that you are stronger and more capable than you think. The paper blurred as Caroline pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. For months, she had believed James had forgotten her, that he had valued their life together, so little he'd left her with nothing. But standing in that garage, surrounded by the scent of oil and steel, she realized the truth was the opposite. He had left her the most precious part of himself, his passion, his dreams, his love, hidden not in a will but in this place. And for the first time since he died, Caroline felt him near again, as if he were standing right beside her, smiling quietly, trusting that she would know what to do next. The next afternoon, Caroline returned to garage number 47 with a thermos of coffee and a notebook tucked under her arm. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the pavement damp and glistening under a pale autumn sun. She unlocked the heavy doors and stepped inside, the familiar scent of oil and cold steel greeting her like an old friend. It felt different now, no longer a strange, hidden place, but something closer to sacred ground. She spent the first hour just walking around the space, touching the workbenches, running her fingers over the neatly arranged tools, rereading James's letters until she could recite the words by heart. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed on her in a way she hadn't expected. This wasn't just a dusty garage. It was an entire part of James's life, a part she'd never known existed. Eventually, Caroline picked up the old rotary phone mounted on the wall and dialed a number she'd found in the small address book James had left behind. The line clicked and a man's voice answered. Tom Callahan, he said. Hi, Tom. This is Caroline Foster, she replied hesitantly. James's wife. There was a pause, then a softer tone. Caroline, I'm so sorry. James was a good man. We've missed him around here. Thank you, she murmured. I found some motorcycles in the garage. I don't really know much about them, and I was hoping you might tell me what they're worth. Tom didn't hesitate. Sure, tell me what you've got. Caroline listed them one by one. the Harley-Davidson in the center of the room, the classic BMW tucked against the far wall, the old Ural she'd nearly overlooked in the corner. Tom let out a low whistle. That Harley? If it's restored the way James used to do them, you're looking at around $100,000. The BMW may be 80. The Ural, if it's original and running, probably north of 130. That's over 300,000 right there, not counting any parts or extras he might have stashed away. Caroline sank into the old wooden chair near the workbench, stunned. $300,000. Added to the $200,000 in cash she'd already found. It was more money than she'd ever seen in her life. Tom cleared his throat. Listen, if you decide you want to sell, I know buyers. They'd line up for James's bikes. We could move them fast, no problem. Thank you, she said quietly. I'll think about it. When the call ended, the garage felt impossibly silent. Caroline poured herself a cup of coffee and sat there for a long time, staring at the Harley gleaming under the light. She could sell everything, she thought. Buy a small house, live comfortably for the rest of her life. No more worrying about rent, about bills. And yet, something about that thought didn't sit right. She wandered over to one of the shelves and noticed a worn leather notebook tucked between two toolboxes. Curious, she opened it. Inside were James's handwritten notes, diagrams of engines, troubleshooting sketches, meticulous lists of parts. And scattered among the technical details were small, almost poetic reflections. Metal forgives mistakes, one line read, but never impatience. Every piece matters, remove one, and everything falls apart. Just like a family. Caroline's throat tightened as she read. This wasn't just about machines. This was James, his philosophy, his heart, the way he saw the world. He hadn't been escaping from their life when he came here. He had been holding on to a piece of himself, nurturing something that had always been a part of him. She looked around the garage once more, at the polished chrome, the neatly labeled bins, the walls lined with photographs of James and his biker friends, smiling in leather jackets beside their restored bikes. This wasn't a workshop. It wasn't even just a legacy. It was a piece of his soul. And for the first time since his death, Caroline began to wonder if selling it would mean losing him all over again. It was a quiet Saturday morning a few days later when Caroline heard the sound of a motorcycle rumbling up the gravel path toward Garage 47. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her coat, and watched as a tall man in a worn leather jacket swung off his bike. He removed his helmet, revealing a face creased by time and weather, and smiled gently. "Mrs. Foster?" he asked. "Yes," Caroline said. "Robert Hayes. But everyone calls me Bobby. James and I were close. Rode together for nearly 20 years. Caroline felt a lump form in her throat. "He spoke about you," she said quietly. Bobby nodded. "He was one of the best men I knew. Generous. Loyal. Always the first to help if someone was stuck on the side of the road. And he loved you, you know. Said you were stronger than you realized." The words hit Caroline harder than she expected. Stronger than she realized. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore. They stepped into the garage, and Bobby walked slowly around the space, touching the edge of a workbench here, a piece of chrome there. "He built a little world here," Bobby said softly. "This place kept him going." Caroline hesitated for a long moment, then blurted out the question that had been circling in her head since she'd read James's letters. "Bobby, would you teach me? How to fix these? How to work on them?" Bobby stared at her, blinking. "Teach you? You mean motorcycles?" She nodded. "I know it sounds ridiculous. I'm 62, and I've never so much as changed a spark plug. But I don't want to sell any of this, not yet. I want to understand what he built here. I want to know this part of him." Bobby scratched the back of his neck. "Caroline, this isn't easy work. It's heavy, dirty, frustrating. You'll bust your knuckles. You'll curse at bolts that won't turn. Most people quit after the first try." "James didn't quit," she said softly. "And I'm his wife. Maybe I can learn." Something in her voice must have convinced him. because Bobby let out a slow breath and nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll start small." The following weekend, Caroline stood beside Bobby as he pulled the seat off an old BMW and exposed the engine beneath. "First lesson," he said. "Respect the machine. Don't rush it." The hours that followed were a blur of grease and sweat. Caroline learned how to remove the engine cover, how to drain and replace oil without spilling it everywhere, how to clean spark plugs caked with carbon. Bobby showed her how to adjust a carburetor, explaining each part's purpose as patiently as if he were teaching a child to read. It was hard, harder than she had imagined. The tools were heavier than they looked, and her hands cramped from turning stubborn bolts. By the end of the day, her fingernails were black with grime, her back ached, and her clothes smelled of gasoline. But she couldn't stop smiling. "You did good," Bobby said, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've got steady hands, and more patience than most." Over the next few weeks, they met every Saturday. Bit by bit, Caroline grew more confident. She learned how to replace a chain, check tire pressure, even recognize the subtle hum of a healthy engine. Bobby watched her progress with quiet approval. "James would be proud," he told her one afternoon as they finished reassembling a carburetor. "Not everyone would have the guts to try this, Caroline, but you do." Word must have spread among James's old biker friends, because before long they started stopping by, first with questions, then with small repair requests. A loose chain here, a dirty spark plug there. Caroline fixed them one by one, carefully applying everything Bobby had taught her. Each time she handed back a repaired part, the pride in her chest grew a little stronger. And though the work was messy and exhausting, it was also something else, something she hadn't felt since James died. Purpose. 6 months slipped by almost without Caroline noticing. The garage that had once felt like a tomb, a place too painful to enter, was now alive with the sound of tools clinking, engines humming, and Caroline's own steady breath as she worked. Saturdays with Bobby had become a routine she looked forward to, and the work that once seemed impossible was now second nature. She could change oil in her sleep, adjust a carburetor by feel, and identify a faulty spark plug just by the way an engine coughed. One afternoon, Tom Callahan stopped by with 2 cups of coffee and leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "You know," he said, "you're better at this than half the guys I ride with." Caroline laughed, shaking her head. "I doubt that." "I'm serious," Tom said, "and I've been thinking, maybe it's time you shared what you've learned. There are plenty of people around here who'd kill for a chance to learn how to do basic maintenance on their bikes. What if you offered a class?" The idea made Caroline freeze. "A class? Me? Tom, I barely know what I'm doing. Barely." He gestured around the garage. "Caroline, you rebuilt a carburetor last week in under 2 hours. That's not barely. That's skill, and people would pay for it." The thought lingered long after Tom left. That night, Caroline sat at her kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. She thought about how terrified she'd been to even open the garage door months ago, and how far she'd come since then. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe she could teach someone else. 2 days later, a small handwritten sign appeared on the bulletin board at a local diner and the community center. Motorcycle repair classes from zero. Learn the basics of maintenance and repair. Beginners welcome. Caroline added her phone number at the bottom and walked away, half hoping no one would call. But the calls came. Within a week, 10 people had signed up, men in their 40s and 50s who had always loved motorcycles but never learned how to care for them, a young woman saving up for her first bike, even a retired mechanic looking for something to do on weekends. Each agreed to pay $500 for a month-long course. On the first day of class, Caroline's hands shook as she greeted them. "I'm not a professional," she warned. "I'm just someone who learned the hard way." "That's the best kind of teacher," one man said, grinning. And so the lessons began. Caroline taught them how to change oil, replace chains, clean spark plugs, and adjust carburetors. the very things Bobby had taught her. She answered questions, demonstrated repairs, and laughed when mistakes happened. The garage echoed with conversation and the metallic rhythm of wrenches on bolts. To her surprise, the classes were a hit. When the first group finished, they told their friends, and the next session filled even faster. Soon, Caroline had a steady income. Between the classes and small repair jobs from James's old biker friends, she was earning more than she ever had on her pension alone. Around the same time, she made another big decision. She sold the restored BMW that had been sitting in the corner, the one Tom had told her was worth a fortune. The sale brought in $80,000, which she deposited into a savings account. It was more money than she'd ever had in her name, and for the first time since James died, the future didn't feel so uncertain. The garage, once a lonely storage space for James's secret life, had transformed into something much bigger. It was now a workshop, a classroom, and a meeting place for people who shared the same passion James had loved. Old bikers stopped by to swap stories. Students lingered after class just to talk about road trips and dream builds. And in the middle of it all was Caroline, not just a widow trying to fill the empty hours, but a teacher, a mechanic, and a part of a community she hadn't known she needed. The space that once held only grief now held laughter, learning, and the promise of new beginnings. It no longer felt like a monument to what she'd lost. It felt like a celebration of everything James had loved and everything she was becoming. A year slipped by, and Caroline's life looked nothing like it had before. Garage 47 had transformed into a small but thriving business. Her weekend classes were booked months in advance. Old bikers stopped by regularly for tune-ups, and the once silent space now buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the hum of engines. For the first time since James's death, Caroline wasn't just surviving, she was living. That was when the phone call came. Mom. Richard's voice on the other end was cautious, almost disbelieving. I heard from someone that you're fixing motorcycles. Caroline smiled to herself. I am, she said, and I enjoy it. It's hard work, but it's good work. And it brings in money, too. There was a pause, then a laugh, sharp and mocking. Mom, you're 62. You're supposed to be relaxing, not crawling around on the floor covered in grease. I like the grease, she replied simply, and I like the work. A few days later, Richard showed up at the garage. He stood in the doorway, taking in the space that now bore little resemblance to the dusty storage unit his father had left behind. Students were gathered around a workbench, learning how to change brake pads. The walls were lined with tools and charts, and Caroline stood in the center of it all, confident and at ease. What is this? Richard asked, looking around in disbelief. A repair shop? A classroom? Both, Caroline said. It's my work now. Richard shook his head, chuckling under his breath. At your age, playing with motor oil and carburetors? It's not exactly dignified. Caroline turned to him, wiping her hands on a rag. Tell me something, Richard. Do you know how much your father's Harley is worth? He shrugged. I don't know. 50,000. 100,000, she said evenly. The words hit him like a punch. What? He snapped. You're telling me that thing is worth 6 figures. Yes, Caroline said. And that's just one of them. Richard's eyes darted toward the gleaming motorcycle in the corner, and Caroline could practically see the calculations forming in his mind. Then sell it, he said quickly. Sell all of them. You could make a fortune. We could split the money. Caroline's face hardened. No, this garage and everything inside it is legally mine. It was left to me, Richard. He stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. That's not fair. If I'd known what this place was really worth, I never would have let you keep it. We could have sold everything and split the cash. We could have, and that, Caroline interrupted gently, is exactly why your father left it to me. Richard froze. What's that supposed to mean? It means he knew you'd sell it all without a second thought, she said. You see money. That's all. I see something else, his love, his memories, his dreams. These machines were part of who he was, and I won't reduce them to a pile of cash. Richard's face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. You're clinging to old junk when you could have a real future. Caroline met his glare calmly. This is my future, and it's not junk. The silence stretched between them, heavy and cold. Then Richard turned and walked out without another word, the door slamming behind him. Weeks turned into months, and Caroline didn't hear from her son. No phone calls, no visits. At first, the quiet stung. She replayed their conversation in her head, wondering if she should have said something different. But over time, that ache softened, because deep down, Caroline knew she had spoken the truth, not just for James, but for herself. She had spent decades living for other people, for James, for Richard, for the life they had built together. Now, for the first time, she was living for her. And whether Richard ever understood that or not, she knew James would. 2 years after James's death, Garage 47 was no longer just a garage. On a soft spring evening, the fading light poured through its open doors, casting a golden glow over rows of motorcycles in various stages of restoration. The rhythmic sounds of wrenches turning and engines sputtering to life, mixed with laughter and easy conversation. What had once been a lonely space filled with grief was now alive, a place of purpose and community. Caroline stood near the workbench that had once been James's, watching as a group of students huddled around a disassembled engine, arguing cheerfully about the next step. A couple of regular customers leaned against the doorway, sipping coffee while they waited for their bikes. The smell of oil and fresh paint lingered in the air, but it no longer reminded her of loss. It reminded her of home. She had become something of a legend in the local biker community, the first woman in Lancaster County to run her own restoration shop and teach motorcycle mechanics. At first, some of the men had been skeptical, but now they brought their bikes to her without hesitation, asking for advice, eager to hear her thoughts. Students spoke of her with respect, calling her Miss Foster even when she insisted they didn't have to. It wasn't just about motorcycles anymore. The garage had become a gathering place, a space where people traded stories, shared tips, and forged friendships over grease-stained hands and shared dreams of open roads. One afternoon, Bobby stopped by after a long ride, wiping the road dust from his jacket before leaning against the workbench. He watched her adjust a carburetor with practiced ease, then smiled. "You know," he said, "James told me something once, back when we were working on that old Ural together." Caroline looked up. "What's that?" He said, "If anything ever happens to me, Caroline's going to be fine. She just doesn't know how strong she is yet." The words settled deep into Caroline's chest. She swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting in her eyes. He really said that? Bobby nodded. Every word. And he was right. After Bobby left, Caroline sat alone at the workbench, her hands resting on the worn wood James had spent so many hours leaning over. The garage was quiet now, the day's lessons finished, the tools neatly put away. She let her eyes drift over the space, over the Harley gleaming in the corner, over the student projects lined up against the far wall, over the faded photographs of James and his friends, still smiling from another lifetime. Her gaze finally landed on the framed photo of James that hung above the workbench. He was younger there, his hair still dark, a grease smudge on his cheek and that familiar half-smile playing on his lips. Caroline rose from her chair and walked over, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered softly, "for this garage, for the life you built here, and for believing in me more than I ever believed in myself." The evening sun dipped lower, and for a brief moment, as the light caught the photo just right, she could almost swear James was smiling back at her. Caroline stayed there for a while, soaking in the quiet hum of the space around her. She was no longer the woman left behind with a crumbling garage and a broken heart. She was a teacher, a mechanic, and a keeper of James's legacy. And she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this place was no longer just about what she had lost. It was about what she had built. It was about the love that still lived in every bolt and screw, every lesson taught, every engine brought back to life. Caroline smiled, turned off the lights, and stepped outside into the warm spring night. The road ahead was still unwritten, but for the first time in years, she was excited to see where it would lead.